Холандската влада вели сајбер дипломатијата е неопходност, а не луксус. Дали би сакали да го елаборирате овој став?
Yes, certainly. Cyber diplomacy is, of course, essential. And why do we believe it is essential? We had a wake-up call as Dutch government, and that was in 2013 when all of a sudden there was an issue with a certificate of websites, and the certificate was called DigiNotar. The integrity of the certificate was breached, and why was it a wake-up call for us as government? Because most of the Dutch government websites were actually had that particular certificate, and it turned out that most likely a foreign government had breached that certificate in order to spy on their own people. So that means that we started to realize that we need to be in contact with other governments to talk about what is normal, responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and that we needed to answer the question, what do you do in case states don't behave according to the rules? Another element in our thinking was that our scientific council for government policy that advises our parliament came up with a report in 2015, and that was about the public core of the internet. And basically, what do we mean with the public core? That is the basic infrastructure and the logical layers and the protocols of the internet. So really the backbone of the internet. And the report said, in case this backbone is being targeted by a cyber attack, it could actually cause our whole internet to collapse, and in an entire country, in an entire region, and with a highly digitalized society, that could mean that could have major impact. So for us, those two elements really, sort of in that time, we really started to think about what should we be doing. And in our constitution, there is actually an element that we need to protect and strengthen the international legal order. So we also wanted to become more active in the international legal order related to the cyber world. Hence, we stepped up our efforts. And I'm happy to explain more about what we do then.
Кој е обемот на вашата работа како холандска амбасадорка за безбедносна политика и сајбер?
Yeah, the scope of my work, well, thank you. I talked about the responsible behavior of states in cyberspace. And one of my tasks is to focus on this normative framework for responsible state behavior. And within the UN, we have formed a consensus. All nations in the world have committed themselves to this normative framework. But that took time to actually come to that consensus. But basically it says that international law also applies in cyberspace. And in addition to that, the UN community has defined sort of additional norms to elaborate. And basically these norms include norms that describe that one needs to protect your own cyber systems. For example, every nation should have a national CERT. Every nation should protect its own strategic infrastructure. But there are also norms that one should not attack each other's strategic infrastructure. So that is one element of my work, and together, of course, with a bigger team. Then there's another element, and that is accountability. What if there are malicious actors in cyberspace? How do we actually hold them accountable? And especially, I'm a diplomat, especially if it's state actors. So then the question arises, what do you do in terms of diplomacy? And there we, of course, have our normal diplomatic toolbox. As governments, you tend to talk to each other, you tend to have dialogue. So that is usually the first step when you see that there is something going on, that you actually have that conversation. But of course, if that conversation doesn't lead to anything, or there is a clear understanding that it is all with a moral intent, then there could be other steps, and like publicly criticizing the country, or even taking steps into the direction of sanctions of certain entities or individuals. So that is the accountability side. And the third part that we focus on is capacity building, because we realize that in the cyber world, everybody is connected, basically the whole world. So it is in our interest as the Netherlands that all countries have actually take care of their own cybersecurity. So that is why we're also here in North Macedonia, but also broader, talking to the region, how to actually build up better resilience and protect the digital systems against cyber attacks, and what is needed for that. And for this particular purpose, we actually established a center, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, and that was established in 2015. And this is like a multi-stakeholder organization where governments are member, the private sector, NGOs, and basically it's a platform where governments can learn from each other and use the expertise in the private sector, in the NGO community, to build up their own resilience.
Како ја оценувате во овој поглед ситуацијата во Западен Балкан и во Северна Македонија, ако имате по-конкретен увид?
Yeah, first of all, I should say I'm a cyber ambassador, and I'm not an expert on this region. But more in general terms, I think what we see when countries are more and more digitalizing, in the past, the tendency was to look at security a bit like an afterthought. Whereas now the realization is much more that while digitalizing and, for example, having more e-government kind of applications, security should be at the core. So from the very first beginning. And that goes for the Netherlands as well as for the Western Balkans. What is also essential in the cybersecurity area is that the internet is owned usually, or in the majority of countries in the world, by private actors, so not by the government. So the government can set rules, and of course is the legislator, but it is the private sector that owns the networks. And so it is really essential that when tackling cybersecurity issues, that there is this public-private cooperation, and therefore we usually use the term multi-stakeholder cooperation, because it's not only about companies and governments working together, but there's also a lot of added value for NGOs who sometimes report on certain vulnerabilities or stress the importance of fundamental rights to protect them online, because there is sometimes a trade-off between security and fundamental rights, and that needs to be debated in a community in order to find the right path forward that all citizens feel comfortable with.
Од ваша перспектива, кој е најдобриот пристап во справувањето со сајбер напади и кампањи за дезинформации?
Yeah. I tend to say resilience, resilience, resilience. I think with any kind of cyber attack, a lot could have been prevented by taking into account basic cyber hygienes. So, and it's not only about the IT guy behind the computer who's responsible for this. This is really at the core of an organization. And I'm happy to see that nowadays cybersecurity is actually on the agenda of the board of companies, of organizations, because there's also the human factor. Every single user needs to be aware that they have a role to play in this cyber world to protect his or her organization from attacks. I mean, it's so easy to click on a link that is a wrong link somehow. Is a phishing attempt, or perhaps starts a certain attack in another way. So it is basic cyber hygienes on the technical side, but then also education of the users, of the citizens. And I think we have really a lot on our plate as societies. Like, the more we are becoming digitalized, the more innovation you see. There are more challenges to actually tackle. And so we really need to follow these innovations and approach the solutions from this multi-stakeholder perspective.
Доколку сте на местото на владата на Република Северна Македонија, кој би бил вашиот приоритет или приоритети на ова поле?
Okay, so the government of North Macedonia, what would I do? Being humble on this, obviously. It's, as I said before, I think basic cyber hygienes are really important. But also, let me elaborate on certain things. We just visited a center of the Ministry of Defense, and that is involved in, among others, disinformation. And they are NATO accredited, and I was really impressed by the things that they do. And I'm also very impressed by the speed in which the Ministry of Defense integrated into the NATO structures. And I think that is really the way to go. Not only NATO, of course, but it's really to go out and see what others have to offer and learn from others. Because you don't want to make the same mistakes as other countries may have made. And so preferably you want to leapfrog and do things right from the very first beginning. And so apart from NATO, there's also, for example, the OSCE, that has developed a lot of confidence building measures. One thing to look at, for example, in the region could be to set up points of contact that could be in touch in case of a big challenge on a cyber threat that could have spillover effects to other countries in the region. You could become a member of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, and for example, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise has developed best practices on how to have procedures for national search, and also how to collaborate with other search. So those are cyber emergency response teams. What I find critical, and I'm actually here for a regional conference where more people from the region who are actually heading search are coming together. What I always very much appreciate is this CERT-to-CERT cooperation, and there is actually an organization first that assists with this kind of cooperation and make sure that all certs have the right kind of threat intelligence at the same time. So it's this kind of cooperation and making sure that the actors within North Macedonia have the right information to act upon. And so go out there and talk to these organizations. So NATO, OSCE, EU, UN, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, regional, and and we will be discussing this tomorrow also at a regional conference.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you. My pleasure.